What drives a person to follow QAnon?
It's interesting. I think depending at what point they joined, there might be different kinds of motivations or combinations. For a lot of the women who joined last summer, in part because they were pulled in with the Save the Children hashtag, the reason to join QAnon, shockingly, might actually come from an altruistic source, like their desire to genuinely help the children. I think that there's a lot of people in QAnon thinking that they are extremely well-intentioned and very concerned because there are tiny little elements of truth in the conspiracy. And so there is problems with child trafficking. There has been a problem with, young women being taken advantage of in Hollywood. I mean, we're hearing now about Matt Gaetz, which again, the irony of the Republicans always being the ones who are the pedophiles. But I think that, and this is again common to something I noticed when I was doing research on ISIS. How did ISIS pull women and girls in? And it was, did you want to help the orphans in Syria? And of course, everybody wants to help the orphans in Syria. So this is where we get this level of, like the road to hell is paved with good intentions, that I think many people start from a very good place. And I think it might be a slippery slope. And from some of the people who have left and have been nice enough to give interviews in the media, we have tiny bits of insight. But, Lenka Perron will say, I never saw anything anti-Semitic. Whereas QAnon is so much about the anti-Semitic tropes. So I think that, not necessarily everyone who believes in Q believes in the entirety of it. And I don't think people start in the deep end. I think they start with something small that has a kernel of truth. And then it is like literally that slippery slope down the rabbit hole.
What commonalities, if any, tie and bind QAnon believers?
So the sort of general QAnon belief is that there is a elite cabal, or as Marjorie Taylor Greene likes to call them, a cable, an elite cabal of child trafficking, blood drinking, pedophile Democrats and elites. And it also then throws in the royal family, like the Windsors, and it has in different countries, it may also then accuse their leadership. So like in France, the QAnon in France accuses Macron of being part of it. But in other places, like in Brazil, they're not sure what to do with Bolsonaro because he's friends with Trump. Because the last part of it, and this perhaps is the part that might be most surprising to the people that enjoy your show, is that Trump is the only one that can save the children. And so in places where they don't much care for Americans, they're still elevating Trump. And it is unusual to see Trump being this popular, and that is still a common factor, and it's all in the QAnon in Latin America in Spanish, and we're seeing it spread. But it's important to know that the local grievances that QAnon pulls in different parts of Europe, it's not the same everywhere. So in Italy, it's anti-vax. In the UK, it's pro-Brexit. But in other places, it's just anti-refugee.
What did your research or interviews show about the impact a QAnon believer can have on families and relationships?
Well, one of the things that I'm going to set from the outset, I think the people who were drawn into QAnon were suffering in some capacity. And I think with the pandemic, many people have been suffering. We've seen an uptick in mental health issues. And so I think that people are suffering in some capacity that brought them into QAnon in the first place. But then they suffer a second time because one of the characteristics of QAnon is you feel like now you have to proselytize. Like as soon as you figure it out, now you feel incumbent on telling everybody. And so I conceive of the possibility that someone discovers what they consider discovers. And of course, the Q drops were preceded. So they think they did the research themselves, but the Q drops were leading them in a particular direction. But that when they figure this out, the first thing they want to do is tell everybody. And I can foresee the possibility of families going, oh my God, your second cousin has gone off the deep end. And, you know, people stop participating on Facebook, or they don't invite them to the Zoom Thanksgiving or that kind of thing. So now they've suffered a second time of losing their family and friend connections. And then the third time, if they're trying to leave, now they're going to suffer again for losing sort of the safety of that bubble, of that ecosystem. So in many ways, you know, for the people we want to try to get out and back into the light, we have to have great empathy for what they've been through and understand that there has been like trauma and suffering at every level.
One of the things, the commonalities I'm finding when I speak with these families is they have nowhere to turn. There's no group to go to. I found a lot of them on this subreddit that has become huge, QAnon casualties.
Yes, I think that's a subreddit that the researcher Marc-Andre Argentino is involved with. He's trying to help the families.
And some of them, those families told me, you know, we turn, but we still don't get any answers. I find a whole bunch of people like myself who say, I don't know what to do. Is there anything you can tell them to do?
Well, so one of the things that my co-author did, her name is Sofia Moskalenko. She's a trained clinical psychologist as well as, you know, an academic. And she kind of wrote the book on radicalization. In fact, she wrote several books on radicalization. So she's very well known in the terrorism field. And one of the things that she said is, first of all, it's not a radicalization problem. In fact, it's much more likely to be a mental health issue. And so we need to disabuse ourselves very quickly of millions of people are about to become, you know, Manchurian candidates and get activated. But also, you know, she agrees with this idea of approaching people with empathy. And this is, it works in the CVE, countering violent extremism. It works in the CVE space. It doesn't work to say you're an idiot, or you're crazy, or you're a lunatic, or blah, blah, blah. What you do is you start with, I know that you're hurting, and I know that you're concerned, or maybe after January 20th, I know you're disappointed because you don't know what's gonna happen. But what she did was she divided the QAnon into 3 categories. The one category of people who have left, and there's different kinds of interventions that's appropriate for that group. Then the larger category you're going to have in this it's a trifurcation, is the people who are starting to have doubts because none of the predictions have come true. We see that, for example, Barack Obama is not in jail. We know that Hillary Clinton has not been hanged. Michelle Obama's not a man. All the stuff that they've been saying for years. But also, they might also start to be disillusioned because you had people like, I guess it was Jim Watkins on his Telegram channel be like, okay, well, that was fun. Sorry, guys, let's move on to the next thing. So people might be disillusioned either because the predictions have become true or because they're starting to have doubts. And Sofia recommends a different kind of intervention, but we should also keep in mind that there's going to be a group of diehards that no matter what happens, they will believe. And I think those are the people that Mike Rothschild is talking in his book about, that these are people who, you know, you're just going to have to, mitigate your expectations that you're going to be able to convince everyone to come into the light. Because listen, we've had conspiracy theories. There are people till this day that believe that Kennedy was shot by, you know, more than one shooter. We have people till this day that believe the moon landing was faked. I mean, you're always going to have people that believe in conspiracy theory. So we just need to whittle it down and provide a pathway for the people who want to get out. And going back to your original point, one of the things we want to do long-term, because the book is just the first part of a larger project, and it's very ambitious, and it's not something ordinarily an academic like myself or Sofia would do. We want to create a website platform that people can, with drop-down menus like, you know, like Jason Galinas' QMAP, but very easy to use, very user-friendly if you're not a very high-tech person. And then allow people to, like, okay, so a woman, this age, this location, generate a pamphlet you can read, but also maybe a local like provider that can address these issues. So we want to make something that is going to help people. And again, it's very unusual and it's very ambitious. And one of the reasons that we brought Shannon Martinez on board, she herself is an ex-neo-Nazi, and she spends all of her time trying to get people out of the far right. And she talks to schools and teachers. So I think that she's going to help us generate also K through 12 materials, because the QAnon children are going to be growing up with this as a belief system that it's a real thing. So we have to also address this like next generation of QAnon that hasn't come into the conspiracy yet, and arm teachers with some, you know, at least some ways to offset those beliefs, or say, okay, well, how about this or how about that? And so we debunk QAnon in the book, but in ways that are not sort of in your face, more very gently pulling at the thread.
And that's what you suggest family members should be doing.
I would suggest, and I'm going to quote, there is an economist at Duke. And again, you would think, what's the connection? But I'll explain this. His name is Dan Ariely. And he says that, you know, people don't start by lying a lot. They start by lying a little bit, and then it's a little bit more, and then you're lying about the lie, and all of a sudden now you're completely embroiled in all these lies. And he says that given the opportunity, most people to turn the page will take it. In other words, what I would recommend to families is to, instead of shunning the QAnon people, bring them back, you know, embrace them back into the family, and just very gently, you know, allow them to speak, ask questions that when they get to something that they can't answer, that plants a seed of doubt. And then you could say, well, you know, I see what you're saying, and absolutely Epstein and Woody Allen and Greenberg. I mean, there's all these people, right? So, but if there was 8 million children missing, wouldn't we be hearing about it? Or you could say, okay, but why is Matt Gaetz involved? Or why are these people who are QAnon now being sort of connected to trafficking or exploitation? So, but it's like asking questions, but not sort of this frontal attack on the person's beliefs, because we know that what happens is people are going to double or triple down, and there's going to be confirmation bias, and they're only going to pay attention to evidence that confirms what they already think. So when you are introducing like the alternative, the reality of it, you have to do so very gently, slowly, and like you plant the seed and then pull back. But I think the idea is that we don't want people feeling completely isolated, that they've abandoned, you know, their families have abandoned them, and the only thing they have left in their life is Q.
And the alternative I'm finding is a lot of times these people will feel so attacked that they just preemptively abandon their family.
Right, and I've heard some of that as well. We've seen a number of children, although, you know, up to the age of 32, but not children, interviewed on CNN, and they, you know, it's very difficult, and it's about sort of outreach at the same time that we're going to try to create better sources of information. Part of the challenge is that we've got a political party in the United States that is using this QAnon very instrumentally. And people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are raising money with the QAnon, or people like General Michael Flynn, who are still going on, well, not TV per se, not a channel, but web channels, spouting the same thing. There's going to be actually in May a QAnon conference in Dallas with all of the QAnon, you know, influencers. And one of the things that I said when I was interviewed, you know, a little over a month ago by Anderson Cooper, I want to separate those people who are exploiting QAnon for their financial gain from the bulk of the people who believe in it, because the bulk of the people I want to help, the people who have been running this kind of Ponzi scheme, they should be in jail.
Finally, what you are doing sounds very much like what many of these families say they are missing in their lives, a resource to turn to. Talk a little bit about your project. The book was part of a larger mission to help pull people out of QAnon.
Well, so the project, the larger project, which is myself and Dr. David Maimon we're both at Georgia State. And then we brought Dr. Moskalenko, my co-author, on board, as well as Shannon Martinez. The idea is that we are seeing conspiracies that are becoming weaponized. So we want to try to understand how any conspiracy goes viral, how it moves from one platform to the next, because really it was a perfect storm of the pandemic where people are feeling discombobulated, and they found that a conspiracy theory, for some strange reason, offers them comfort and succor in the face of all this unknown and nervousness. But then also QAnon moved to platforms like Instagram. And so it became, it embedded in a completely different set of a community. When it was on the Chans or 8kun, that is a very narrow group of people. But when it jumped the shark and it went to Facebook and it went to Twitter, and Facebook didn't do, considering Reddit banned it in 2018, Facebook and Twitter were very slow to act. But once it went to Instagram, that's really where it went viral. And so we have to understand, can we interrupt this process of getting bigger and bigger? But the long term was also to offer people a resource that, we can explain it. We can, and again, like a pamphlet's not going to solve everything, but at least it's a place to start. We can offer resources to say, if you're in Michigan, here are people you can talk to. If you're in Florida, here are some people. But as long as one channel, which is very popular, Fox News, and one political party keeps the ball rolling, we are, basically, it's like the labors of Sisyphus. We're rolling that giant rock up a hill only to have the GOP unleash it again. And so we feel like we need to have better sources of information, but we also need to have a culture of responsibility where the Republicans stop this nonsense. John Boehner knows better.
Is the website far enough along where it's like, we hope to have it together by X date, or is that still in the kind of conceptualizing stages?
It's in the conceptual stage, in part because that's sort of the long-term goal. But what we wanted to do with the book is, and again, very unusual for a book that's written by, 2 PhDs, we wanted to have like step-by-step, how do you deal with a family or friend who's in QAnon? And because Sophia is such an excellent psychologist, she's able to combat some of the issues that people will encounter. Like, she's giving helpful hints and she's providing some insights. But, this QAnon problem was not created overnight. And so we're not going to be able to solve it overnight. And I think that's why I'm advocating a measured step-by-step. I want to encourage people, if you have family members in QAnon, be patient, understand that, there's 3 layers of suffering and trauma that they're experiencing or have experienced. And empathy is probably the best approach rather than ridicule.
Final question, for those family members struggling with somebody close to them that is a follower of QAnon, what is the message of hope?
Well, the message of hope is that this is what I was saying when I was trying to convince people not to join ISIS. We have this assumption that when we experience or see something outrageous, it's only going to have sort of negative antisocial outcomes. What about a pro-social response? And the example that I give, which is a personal example, was that for 4 years, I was pretty angry and outraged. And I'm not going to say why, but I marched a lot and I gave money to charity and I volunteered my time. So the message of hope is, if you really want to help the children, why don't you work in a shelter? Why don't you do after school programs? Like, do something where you will be able to feel that you're making a difference, not as a keyboard warrior, but actually helping children. And by actually helping children, that will fill that need, maybe that QAnon was filling for you.
And what is the message of hope for a family member who wants that QAnon loved one back with them and out of this world?
Well, I think that the more people come forward, and this is the part that confused me, that Sidney Powell is still speaking at this QAnon conference for patriots in Dallas. The more that they recant, oh, I was just kidding, nobody would take me seriously because they're being sued by Dominion or someone else. I think that we have to improve sources of information. We also have to reinvigorate local newspapers, because by killing off the local newspapers, people are going to be getting their news from sources where those sources haven't been vetted and they're not written by professional journalists. And, it's clickbait. So the hopeful message for the families is, I don't think that this is sustainable long term, because nothing, like what they're going to see is, it's not the purge. Situation's getting better. The country's going back to almost normal with the vaccine. At a certain point, they're going to look around and say, oh, okay, well, I guess it's okay. And so I think that it's just, in the long term, it's not a sustainable conspiracy. There was this joke once that was made that I think Benjamin Franklin said, you can have a conspiracy between three people if two of them are dead. So, like, in other words, if there was a conspiracy like Tuskegee, which is actually a conspiracy that was true, at a certain point, the information is leaked. If there was a conspiracy about children, at a certain point, we would have evidence, and we don't have the evidence. They'll always say, oh, the evidence is plentiful, but there's not actual evidence. But also, one of the things I put in the book, the Trump family made a big to-do about $35 million that was going to be invested to combat child trafficking. They didn't use any of that. And so I think that at a certain point, people will start to have doubts, and that's where you have this opportunity. And I just wanted to say one thing about doubting. When people are doubting, sometimes their behavior doesn't match what's inside in their hearts and minds. And I'll give you the example. We know this from Christian Picciolini's experiences as a former neo-Nazi, trying to leave the Nazi movement. And he talks about it in his books. And he's written several autobiographies. And he says that when he was starting to have doubts about the neo-Nazis, he was so worried someone would find out he had doubts. He got more tattoos. He beat up more people of color. So his outward actions didn't actually match the doubts. So even if the family member seems to still be going on and on about Q, they still might have doubts. So don't give up on them. And, again, invite them back to the family and invite them to tell us more, and then ask questions so that when they get to the point where they can't explain it, that is the seed of doubt you've planted.